You wake up and your throat feels like sandpaper. Your head is pounding in a slow, ugly rhythm. You shuffle to a cabinet, swallow something manufactured in a factory you've never seen, and by lunchtime, you're mostly fine. Now, strip that away. No cabinet, no factory, no one to tell you whether that headache is nothing or something. Just you, whatever plants happen to be growing nearby, and a few 100,000 years of accumulated guesswork standing between you and the dirt. And yet they made it. Not just survived, but thrived enough to raise children, build cities, cross oceans, and eventually produce someone reading this sentence. Before germs had a name, before anyone knew what a virus even was. So how? Here's the trap almost everyone falls into when they picture ancient healers. They imagine a slightly dumber version of a modern doctor, standing in a forest wishing he had antibiotics. That image is wrong, and it's wrong in an interesting way. These weren't people fumbling in the dark. They were running the longest, largest, most brutal research program in human history, and the data was written directly into who survived and who didn't. When your life depends on knowing which berry stops diarrhea and which one kills you in an hour, you pay very close attention. You notice, you remember, and crucially, you tell someone else, who tells someone else, across generations, until that knowledge becomes so deeply embedded in a culture that nobody even remembers it was ever discovered. That's not folklore, that's data compression across deep time. The evidence for this goes back astonishingly far and not even to our own species. In a cave called Shanidar, in what's now Iraq, archaeologists uncovered a Neanderthal burial containing dense clusters of pollen from yarrow, groundsel, and other flowering plants. The leading interpretation is that these weren't wind-blown accidents. Someone placed them there deliberately around a body. Several of those exact plant species are still used in herbal remedies today, and some have measurable medicinal effects in clinical studies. A species that went extinct tens of thousands of years ago may have been practicing plant medicine before modern humans even arrived on the continent. Then, in 1991, two hikers in the Alps stumbled onto something even more startling. A man, frozen and preserved for over 5,000 years, now known as Otzi. He wasn't just carrying tools and weapons. He was carrying birch fungus, a substance with real antimicrobial and antiparasitic properties, tucked into his gear like a portable first aid kit. His skin bore dozens of small tattoo-like markings, and when researchers mapped them against his skeleton, they lined up almost perfectly with joints showing signs of degenerative wear. His knees, his lower back. It looks less like decoration and more like an early attempt at targeted pain relief, centuries before anyone wrote the word acupuncture. Once modern humans spread across the planet, this kind of plant knowledge didn't just persist, it exploded. Willow bark contains a compound called salicin, chemically related to the aspirin sitting in your medicine cabinet right now. Ancient Egyptians used it. So did the Greeks, separately. So did healers in China, and in North America, none of them aware the others existed. That's not coincidence. That's the same experiment being run independently on 4 continents. Chew this, pain goes down. Repeated by accident millions of times until it became tradition. Garlic showed up in Egyptian medical texts as an infection fighter, and modern labs have confirmed it genuinely has antimicrobial properties. Turmeric, used across Ayurvedic medicine for thousands of years, contains curcumin, a compound with documented anti-inflammatory effects. Echinacea, borrowed from Native American healing traditions, is still sitting on pharmacy shelves in your neighborhood right now. None of this was random chewing. Ancient healers developed real preparation techniques, knowing which roots needed drying, which plants needed boiling, which combinations masked bitterness or improved absorption. Layer enough of those small discoveries on top of each other, generation after generation, and you get something that looks less like superstition and more like pharmacology without the lab coats. The sample size was the entire species. The method was chaos. The failure rate was brutal, but the results, again and again, held up. Now, for something that kills fast, wounds. A hunt gone wrong, a fall, a fight, In a world without stitches or antiseptic, a simple cut could become a death sentence within days. So what did people actually do about it? Start with honey. Ancient Egyptians packed it directly onto open wounds, and it turns out that wasn't superstition at all. Honey has a naturally low pH, a high sugar content, and it slowly releases small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, three separate properties that make it genuinely hostile to bacteria. Modern medicine eventually caught up. There's a clinically approved wound care product made from medical-grade honey used in hospitals today. Next, certain clays. Some are rich in minerals with real antimicrobial effect, and cultures across the globe, completely disconnected from one another, independently reached for clay poultices when skin split open. Then there's the one that makes people flinch. Maggots. Fly larvae deliberately placed on infected wounds. It sounds horrifying until you understand what maggots actually do. They eat only dead, rotting tissue and leave healthy flesh completely untouched. Cultures from Australia to Central America use this technique long before anyone understood why it worked, and modern hospitals still use medical-grade maggot therapy today for wounds that won't respond to antibiotics. And spider silk, pressed onto bleeding cuts by Greeks, Celts, and Native American healers alike, actually contains vitamin K, which plays a real role in blood clotting. Researchers today are studying spider silk as a biomaterial for wound closure. Somehow, without microscopes, without any concept of bacteria, these separate cultures kept arriving at solutions that modern science would later validate. But the most jaw-dropping part isn't wound care, it's surgery. Archaeologists have found skulls, some over 9,000 years old, with clean, deliberate holes drilled or scraped into them, a practice called trepanation. And the bone around those holes shows signs of healing. That means the patient didn't die on the table. Some skulls show multiple healed trepanation sites on the same person, meaning they survived the procedure more than once. Nobody knows the full reasoning, whether it was relieving pressure from head trauma, treating seizures, or some blend of medicine and ritual that ancient people didn't separate the way we do. What's undeniable is that Stone Age humans were performing brain surgery, and it was working often enough to keep doing it. The evidence for surgical skill doesn't stop at the skull. A skeleton found in France, roughly 7,000 years old, shows a forearm amputation where the bone had clearly begun regrowing, meaning the person survived long enough to heal. That's not a lucky accident. That requires wound management, infection control, and someone keeping that person fed and alive during recovery. It's a functioning medical support system, full stop. Even teeth got this treatment. A 14,000-year-old tooth from northern Italy shows unmistakable signs of deliberate drilling to scrape out decay, the earliest known dental procedure. A few thousand years later, in what's now Slovenia, someone had a cavity packed with beeswax, the oldest known dental filling on record. Long before anyone used the word dentist, someone was already sitting a patient down and treating a rotten tooth on purpose. Put this next to a strange, uncomfortable fact about our own history. Antiseptic technique, the simple idea that a surgeon should wash his hands before cutting someone open, didn't become standard practice until the 1860s. Before that, hospital mortality rates in the 1840s were sometimes worse than the death rate from battlefield injuries, because hospitals themselves were breeding grounds for infection. Which means a trepanation performed outdoors, in open air, with a freshly napped stone blade, may in some narrow sense have carried a lower infection risk than a modern operating room a mere century and a half ago. History doesn't always move in a straight line. None of this explains everything, though. Plants and stitches only get you so far. The bigger, quieter reason ancient humans survived is something they carried inside them without ever choosing to. An immune system shaped by relentless evolutionary pressure into something remarkably capable. The immune system learns. Every generation exposed to a pathogen produces some survivors who are just slightly better equipped to fight it, and those survivors pass that resilience forward. Children who made it through a brutal early childhood, and many did not, often grew into adults with formidable immune defenses, hardened by repeated exposure nobody was tracking or measuring. Multiply that across thousands of years and you get populations calibrated, generation by generation, against their local diseases. Its herd immunity, built the slow and merciless way without a single vaccine. This is also the dark key to one of history's worst catastrophes. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, it wasn't superior weapons or superior biology that caused the staggering death toll among indigenous populations. It was centuries of prior immune exposure. European populations had been building resistance to smallpox, measles, and influenza for generations. Indigenous American populations had never encountered those diseases and had no inherited defense against them. In some regions, the death toll reached 90%. Meanwhile, the reverse was also true. European settlers often struggled badly against diseases indigenous populations had long since adapted to. The immune system, it turns out, is really just a record of what your ancestors managed to survive. And there's a second, less visible battlefield: your gut. Modern research increasingly points to the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living inside your intestines, as central to immune function and even mental health. By that measure, ancient humans were probably walking around with spectacular gut health by today's standards. They ate wildly diverse diets. They were constantly in contact with soil and its microorganisms. They weren't scrubbing every surface of their lives into sterility. Fermentation shows up almost everywhere history looks. Sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, injera, dozens of regional variations, all independently discovered as ways to keep food from spoiling. But fermentation does something else along the way. It loads food with living, beneficial bacteria, turning an ordinary preservation trick into what amounts to a daily probiotic dose. Studies comparing modern hunter-gatherer populations to industrialized ones consistently find dramatically higher microbial diversity in the former, and higher diversity tracks with stronger immune function and lower rates of autoimmune disease. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. Bioarchaeologists studying ancient Nubian skeletons, dating back roughly 1,500 years, found something embedded directly in the bone itself: tetracycline, a real functioning antibiotic. Nobody was manufacturing it on purpose. The likely source was a fermented grain beer, contaminated during brewing with a bacterium that happens to produce the compound naturally. Which means an entire population was regularly, unknowingly dosing itself with a genuine antibiotic through its everyday drink over 1,000 years before anyone in a lab isolated penicillin. They had no idea what bacteria were. They just knew that beer, brewed a certain way, seemed to help. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's the strangest one: belief itself. If you're convinced you're going to get better, you often do. That's not mysticism, it's documented neuroscience. The placebo effect produces measurable changes in pain perception, immune activity, and recovery time. And it works even in people who know full well they're taking a placebo. Ancient healers understood this long before anyone had a name for it. The chanting, the fire, the specific plants, the whole community gathered around a sick person wasn't just theater, it was a signal, delivered directly to the patient's nervous system. You are being cared for. People are fighting for you. That signal has real physiological consequences. Cortisol drops. Pain perception shifts. In many cases, recovery genuinely improves. It wasn't medicine in the modern sense, but it wasn't nothing either. Fairness demands the other half of this story, though, because ancient medicine had brutal limits. Once a bacterial infection crossed a certain threshold, there was often nothing anyone could do. Appendicitis, a condition solved today with a routine hour-long surgery, was a near-certain death sentence. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for both mother and child. Broken bones that healed badly meant permanent disability. In many ancient populations, somewhere between a quarter and half of all children died before reaching adulthood, which is why average life expectancy numbers from that era look so grim, often 30 to 35 years. But that number is heavily distorted by early childhood deaths. Someone who survived childhood and avoided violence or a dangerous birth could easily live into their 50s, 60s, even 70s, sometimes carrying healed fractures or severe arthritis for decades. And here's a sobering thought worth sitting with. Many of the diseases that killed people in the ancient world are still killing people today, right now, in places without access to modern medicine. Malaria, tuberculosis, cholera. These aren't exotic relics of the past. Modern medicine isn't a background convenience. It's one of the genuine landmark achievements in human history, and it's worth pausing occasionally to actually feel amazed by it. Across the world, different civilizations built their own sophisticated medical traditions in parallel. Egyptian physicians, documented in a medical text from around 1550 BCE, cataloged over 700 remedies alongside surprisingly accurate descriptions of the circulatory system. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine mapped the body through acupuncture and herbal formulas refined over centuries. In India, a physician named Sushruta described surgical techniques, including an early form of reconstructive nose surgery, so advanced that European surgeons were still traveling to learn from his methods more than 2,000 years later. The Greek physician Hippocrates pushed forward a radical idea that illness came from natural causes rather than angry gods, an idea that quietly became the foundation of all modern medicine. And in ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets over 4,000 years old record symptom, plant, preparation, and dosage in a format that looks unmistakably like a prescription. Strip away the cuneiform, and the underlying structure is identical to what your doctor writes today. What actually kept people alive, in the end, wasn't any single trick. It was plants that happened to contain real compounds. Wound care built on accidental but genuine science. Immune systems hardened by generations of exposure. Gut bacteria nurtured by fermented food and a less sterile way of living. Healers who understood, even without the language for it, that belief and community could physically change the body's chemistry. And underneath all of it, connection. Humans who cared for their sick, protected their weak, and valued the knowledge carried by their elders. Loneliness is now known to be one of the strongest predictors of early death, on par with smoking. Isolation kills. Connection heals. That was true 50,000 years ago, and it hasn't stopped being true. You have MRI machines and gene sequencing and organ transplants now, tools that would look like sorcery to anyone living before 1850. And yet, the fundamentals haven't moved an inch. Eat something diverse. Stay close to other people. Move your body. Sleep enough. The advice sitting in your doctor's office today isn't so different from what a healer said to a patient beside a fire 10,000 years ago. The tools changed completely. The person underneath them didn't change at all. Your ancestors looked at a world built almost entirely out of things that could kill them, and through observation, memory, community, and a genuinely impressive willingness to try almost anything, maggots included, they figured out how to not die. Often enough, at least, to eventually produce you,